Welcome to the set of lectures that will cover the autonomic nervous system. To begin, let's compare the autonomic nervous system to the somatic nervous system. The somatic nervous system has ultimate control over skeletal muscle. So when your body moves using skeletal muscle contraction, that is stimulated by the somatic nervous system. Specifically, somatic motor neurons found in either spinal nerves or cranial nerves. I'll remind you that these motor neurons use acetylcholine as their neurotransmitter. The autonomic nervous system controls basically everything else. Organs that contain smooth muscle, for example, your respiratory tract, your GI tract, your urinary tract, reproductive tract and organs, as well as organs such as blood vessels that contain smooth muscle. Your heart is controlled using the autonomic nervous system, and a whole set of glands are controlled using the autonomic nervous system. When we study the autonomic nervous system, we have to divide it into two divisions. One being the sympathetic division, and two being the parasympathetic division. These two divisions are how we can change what these organs are doing based on the body's situation. One situation the body might be in is what we would call a fight or flight response. This is usually in response to some emergency or stressful situation. The parasympathetic division is more active during resting activities. So we often call parasympathetic rest and digest. So an organ like the heart has to be able to respond during an emergency situation by increasing the rate of contraction, so increase heart rate. It also needs to beat harder to distribute more blood. We need more blood distribution during fight or flight, so we can distribute energy throughout the body. Whereas when you're at rest, that heart needs to be able to respond to parasympathetic stimulation by slowing down. So your heart rate will slow down during rest. So that's the thing we're going to do during these lectures, is really compare what the body needs to do when you're in fight or flight and compare what the body's going to do when you're resting. There are some ways to remember what sympathetic responses are. We call them the E situations. E stands for energy production, so situations where the body needs energy. Embarrassment is a sympathetically driven response. Excitement, exercise, and emergency. So those are what we call E situations. Whereas parasympathetic, we often think of rest and digest. We also use SLUD to help us remember. SLUDD. The S stands for saliva. So salivary glands are stimulated by parasympathetic neurons. L stands for lacrimal glands, so tear production. U stands for urinary, so urination is parasympathetic. One of the D's is for digestion, the other D is for defecation. This doesn't give you everything, but that gives you a lot of information about the difference between sympathetic and parasympathetic. This figure I think we've seen in the past. It was kind of an introductory figure to the nervous system, where we have the CNS up top, brain and spinal cord. The CNS is going to get sensory information. That's all the blue arrows. It gets somatic senses, which are senses throughout your body, senses in your skin, senses in your muscle, those all go using somatic sensory neurons, but also special senses. For example, when you consciously see an object, when you hear sounds, when you taste, when you smell, those are special senses. That's part of your somatic nervous system. Autonomic sensory neurons come from internal organs. So this is usually subconscious. You don't perceive these internal senses. And then the GI tract has sensory receptors to monitor what's going on in your GI tract. So that's the sensory part of these three divisions. The motor aspect of the somatic nervous system are those somatic motor neurons voluntarily stimulating skeletal muscle. Autonomic nervous system, this is where we're going to spend most of our time looking at involuntary control of smooth muscle organs, the heart and glands, using either sympathetic impulses or parasympathetic impulses. Enteric nervous system we'll talk a little more about in A&P2, but you'll notice this little arrow refers to the fact that your autonomic nervous system does influence the enteric nervous system. Here's a thorough table comparing the somatic and autonomic nervous systems using sensory input, control, so what part of the brain or spinal cord, the motor pathway, what neurotransmitters are used, who are the effector organs, and then what do? What are their responses? So number one, sensory input of the somatic nervous system comes from somatic senses and special senses. Again, somatic senses you can think of when you touch an object, pain, temperature, when you feel changes in temperature. Those are all somatic senses. And then special senses would be vision, taste, smell, and hearing. The parts of the brain involved in your somatic really revolve around the cerebral cortex. Areas in the cerebral cortex are going to be sending out nerve impulses down the somatic motor neurons. The somatic nervous system, the motor pathway uses a single neuron. What that means is it takes one neuron to get from the CNS to the skeletal muscle. And we'll look at an image coming up to help us understand that. Those neurons use acetylcholine. We should already know that. Acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter released by somatic motor neurons. They control skeletal muscle, and what we mean by controlling a skeletal muscle is stimulating it to contract. So there's your somatic nervous system. Autonomic nervous system, the receptors are mainly internal receptors, enteroreceptors. We also call those visceral receptors. So we're monitoring the inside of the body. A little bit from your somatic senses and special senses. The area of the brain intimately involved is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is very important in involuntary control of organs. There's some limbic system involvement, so that's emotions. So emotions can influence your involuntary responses. One thing you could think about there is a lie detector test. A lie detector test is monitoring involuntary responses, but when you're asked questions that might bring up emotions, that might influence those responses, such as heart rate, such as blood flow, such as sweating. There's also other areas in the brainstem which are involved with the control of this motor output. The motor neurons come in pairs, so it's a two motor neuron pathway, and we'll look at an image that again help us understand what that means. But basically, to get the information from the CNS to the effector, you have to have two neurons. And those two neurons have to have a connection called a synapse. Neurotransmitters used, we're going to look closely at who uses acetylcholine versus who uses norepinephrine. Norepinephrine acts as a neurotransmitter specifically for the sympathetic nervous system. Effectors, we're going to look at how these organs respond to either sympathetic or parasympathetic, and then what do they do. So this is a pretty thorough table comparing the somatic nervous system to the autonomic nervous system. Okay, what we're going to do now is just to look at and think about some of the basic responses of both sympathetic and parasympathetic. And when we do this, I want you to put yourself in a situation. For parasympathetic, you're going to be resting. So you're either sitting in class watching a lecture, or you're sitting on your sofa watching TV, or maybe you're lying in bed taking a nap. So that's going to be our parasympathetic. For sympathetic, I want you to think about a fight or flight response, or one of those E situations. A good one would be exercising. So if you exercise quite a bit, I want you to think about what your body does during exercise. Or an emergency situation, maybe a car accident. We're going to go down some of the basic parasympathetic responses first. And the parasympathetic division is more dominant. If you think about throughout the day, you're more often in a parasympathetic situation than sympathetic, right? You're resting, you're sleeping at night, you're sitting down for a meal, you're in class. Those are all resting activities. Okay, first one, let's think about the cardiovascular system. The cardiovascular system's number one job is to distribute things throughout the body. And one thing that the cardiovascular system distributes is energy in the form of glucose, in the form of fatty acids, also distributing oxygen, because you need oxygen to be able to obtain the energy from glucose and fatty acids. So during parasympathetic situations, you don't need much energy. So your heart rate can go down and your blood pressure can go down. So when you're sitting in class, if you were to take a pulse, your heart rate would be pretty low, somewhere maybe in the range of 60 to 75 beats a minute. So that's a slow heart rate. And that slow heart rate is due to parasympathetic stimulation of the heart, which slows it down. Those neurons happen to be in the vagus nerve. Your vagus nerve keeps your heart rate down during rest. Blood pressure is low as well. Next thing, along the same lines of energy, is you need oxygen for energy, or you don't need as much oxygen when you're at rest. So when you're at rest, your airways can constrict. We call that bronchoconstriction. Broncho refers to the bronchioles. Bronchioles are little airways down in your lungs. Those can constrict. They can kind of reduce their diameter because you don't need much oxygen when you're resting. Along the same lines, your respiratory rate is low when you're at rest. Your body is more in an energy storing state, so your body doesn't waste energy. That's one thing the human body is really good at, is if you're not utilizing energy at that moment, its job is to store it for later. We're not going to get rid of it. For example, you're not going to have energy molecules in urine. Urine doesn't have glucose, shouldn't have fatty acids in it, shouldn't have amino acids in it. Because all those sources of energy, if you're not using them, you're going to store them. So one way we store energy is we take glucose and convert it into glycogen. And glycogen can be stored in your liver. We might also convert that into fat. So we'll store energy in the form of triglycerides. when we're at rest. Next one has to do with digestion. So typically anything related to your digestive system, you want to think parasympathetic, whether that's producing enzymes, either at your stomach or pancreas produces digestive enzymes, and small intestine. The motility, that's the smooth muscle of the GI tract, that's stimulated using parasympathetic neurons. Pupils are more in a constricted state when you're at rest, or if there's light. So when you think about a pupil, you want to think of a couple things. One is the iris is what determines the size of your pupil. The iris is that pigmented part that you see in someone's eye. Well, light will affect that iris. When there's bright light, it'll constrict the pupil. When there's dim light, it'll dilate the pupil. But that's using the autonomic nervous system to do it. So parasympathetic will constrict, sympathetic will dilate. Your eyes are also much better at near vision when you're at rest. So there's another little muscle in the eye called the ciliary muscle. Its job is to control your lens. And that lens helps you focus. For example, if you're reading, we typically read when we're at rest. It's very difficult to read when you're in a fight or flight mode. Tear secretion is parasympathetic. The urinary bladder is stimulated by parasympathetic neurons. The muscle of the bladder is called the detrusor muscle. That helps you urinate. Urinating is much easier when you're resting. Let's look at the fight or flight side. A lot of these are opposite of parasympathetic. You're going to increase your heart rate using sympathetic stimulation. Your blood pressure is going to go up. One way that is done is constricting blood vessels. Vaso refers to blood vessel, whereas broncho refers to airway. So fight or flight causes constriction of blood vessels. That increases the pressure. More pressure in the cardiovascular system, we can distribute more energy. Your airways, on the other hand, will dilate because we need more oxygen. So bronchodilation is sympathetic. Blood sugar goes up. We break down fat, so that's called lipolysis. Lipo refers to lipids or fats. Lysis means to break down. That's a way to mobilize energy, to get more energy distribution. Digestive processes are inhibited by sympathetic stimulation. So if you think about exercising, typically it's not a great idea to eat and then go exercise. Because if you eat, that food will sit in your stomach while you're exercising. The stomach is not very active when you're exercising. So that food just kind of sits in your stomach, and usually people don't feel very well if they eat and then exercise. Go ahead and eat after you exercise, when your stomach can then be stimulated by parasympathetic activity. Pupils dilate. One thing you might want to think about there is if you get in a car accident, you want to be able to assess your environment. Maybe it's a severe accident and you need to get out of that car. Your pupils will dilate. That allows you to see more of your environment. But notice near vision is more parasympathetic. Distant vision is more sympathetic. Enhanced mental alertness, that typically helps you deal with an emergency situation. You're going to increase metabolism. So these are reactions that are occurring that either produce energy or utilize energy. So your metabolism is much higher during sympathetic situations. Exercise, fight or flight, emergency. Finally, you also have a response due to the heat production during sympathetic activity. You're going to get a lot of heat produced when your metabolism goes up. So the body has to counter that by thermoregulatory responses, such as sweating. We'll come back to this, but sweating is actually known as cholinergic. Cholinergic means it's stimulated by acetylcholine. These other sympathetic responses are all adrenergic, meaning they're stimulated by norepinephrine. So norepinephrine is really the hormone that does all these things. Increases heart rate, increases blood pressure, dilates the airways, inhibits digestion, dilates the pupil. Those are all norepinephrine. These parasympathetic responses are acetylcholine, so they're cholinergic. So there's one exception here, that sweating is cholinergic, whereas most of the other sympathetic responses are norepinephrine. One last one, erection of hair. That's usually a stress response, and that is a sympathetic stimulation of the little muscles attached to the hair follicles. So your hairs will typically stand up when you're having some sort of a sympathetic activity, like fear. Okay, the next video we're going to look at these motor neuron pathways. So how do the impulses get from the CNS, like the spinal cord, to the effector organs?